I'm so excited to have today two people in the podcast, Michael Stockhill and Pike Oliver. And they came to us because we did an episode on the Irvine Ranch, and they actually worked at the Irvine Company and actually wrote the next book I was about to read on the Irvine Ranch. So fascinating how when you put your mind to something, you really draw the people into that. So first, why don't you guys tell us a little bit about you?
Go ahead, Pike.
Pike Oliver. I started life as an urban planner. Uh, got a degree from UCLA a half a century ago and spent some time in the realm of public policy, but very shortly found my way to working at the Irvine Company in the late 1970s, just after the James Irvine Foundation had sold it, which is a topic that's addressed in some detail in our book, and spent about 8 years there in various roles, mainly on strategic planning, implementing settlements to litigation, working on funding infrastructure in the years following the passage of Proposition 13. And looking back, it was one of the most energizing and exciting work experience I've had in a now long career.
Stephanie, thanks for having us. Mike Stockstill here. I started as a journalist, joined the Irvine Company in the public relations side, and then moved over during the 13 years I was there to finish doing a lot of political work. We had advocates in Washington, D.C. and in Sacramento that I worked with, and the company really had a leadership role 3 times in trying to pass and finally passing an initiative here in Orange County to fund transportation. I left after 13 years, did a variety of public affairs type jobs, finished as a consultant, and am now retired.
Incredible. And you both participated in writing a book called Transforming the Irvine Ranch, which also one of the heiresses, Joan Irvine, participated in. I would love how did you guys get to write a book and what was the reasoning behind it?
Well, I think we've always loved history, both of us. When we were together at the Irvine Company, we nosed around and asked questions about the background of the company. We read the book and we talked to other people who had actually lived it. Um, Fast forward 40 years after talking about it for many times, Pike called me one day and said, why don't we write that book? And as we set out, a week later, COVID hit. So we had a lot of time on our hands, and we set out to do the research, to talk to people we knew who had lived it. Fortunately, we got to a lot of folks. These were all people in their 80s, some of them in their 90s. And we had, as we mentioned earlier, Ray Watson's writings. Ray had written 6 chapters. He gave a 500-page oral history. And with that as a base, we set out to write the book and had a great time doing it.
Incredible.
Yeah, the people that we met were people who had worked in the formative years of the transformation that we write about in our book, when really the big plan, we call it, got going, when UCI, the University of California at Irvine, came to the Irvine Ranch, which is a significant marker in the history of its transformation. And as I recall, we interviewed 43 of these folks who, as Mike says, were in their 80s and 90s. In fact, 7 of them, we started this four years ago, 7 of them have since passed on. So it was sort of a just-in-time carpe diem effort. Mike had talked about doing this for decades. And, when I called him, I said, Mike, we're not getting any younger, and all these folks are definitely not getting any younger. And if we're going to get the story told, it's time to do it. And so that was really the motivating factor. And as Mike says, it was a very energizing and exciting experience to do it.
That's very cool. Thank you for doing that for society and all of us and real estate investors. I think there are a lot of things we can learn from your experience and all these interviews. In today's episode, I would love to, number one, try to get into Bren's brain and try to understand how did he get himself into the Irvine company from your perspective, right? And also, I would love to touch on the biggest problems you guys have worked on. How did you deal with them? So whoever would like to start, maybe share, how do you think Bren got himself into the Irvine company? What did it take, right? Because he didn't own it 100% at first. If you know about that part, I'd love to learn.
Well, Donald Bren had an interest in planned communities as a young man and as a builder. He started his own building company in his late 20s. He was 31 years old when he and some partners purchased 11,000 acres of what is now Mission Viejo, which is south of the Irvine Ranch. And so if you read the oral histories from that time, you see Bren is very interested in whole communities. He's interested in design. Unfortunately, that was kind of a bridge too far. Bren sold out after 3 years, and eventually Mission Viejo was bought by Philip Morris. They had the deep pockets. But his interest never lagged. He kept his eye on the Irvine Ranch. He built houses on the ranch. And in 1976, it became apparent that the ranch was going to go up for sale. That's a story in and of itself we can tell at another time. But Bren rounded up $100 million and was prepared to join the bidding, and the bidding very quickly exceeded that. And so he was invited into the winning group, which was headed by Al Taubman from Detroit and included Joan Irvine. And in 1977, he owned 35% of the Irvine company, but he did not have control, and the other owners rallied around Al Taubman. And Taubman really, for the next 5 years, kind of became the real force in terms of decision making at the ranch. So I'll let Pike pick it up from 1983 on.
Right. So Al Taubman, as many of your listeners probably know, was a major force in the world of shopping center development. And he was based out of Michigan. And he didn't really have a background in large-scale planned community development, especially in the context of all the planning and regulatory issues that were becoming so challenging in California. And many of those emerged in the years following the acquisition. And there were different views on how to proceed with those. So the long and the short of it is, about 6 years later, probably influenced somewhat with some funding challenges that the Taubman Company was facing, Donald Bren got word that Mr. Taubman might be interested in liquidating his investment. And so he put together what was essentially a leveraged buyout of the Irvine Company and got Joan Irvine to agree to be bought out, although an important footnote there is she did not agree on the price, and the price for her shares was litigated over the following, I guess, about 6 years.
Right.
And then ultimately resolved in terms of interest and all that she would be paid in the early 90s. So as of 1983, then Donald Bren had full control of the company and was the decision maker for how to proceed, which was a fascinating time to be there. A lot of things accelerated in working out issues and meeting challenges with transportation funding, as well as some other issues associated with residential leaseholds that had been in place for several decades and were coming up for renewal.
And Stephanie, I think it's really important to look back from 1983 back to 1960, which is the portion of our book that we talk about just the amazing things that happened on the Irvine Ranch in a relatively short period of time. And when you think about what was going on, Orange County was growing rapidly because post-war development. There was a big employment base for aerospace. And the Irvine Company and planning, as we describe it in one chapter, we call it the magic of planning. Planning was celebrated. Planners were important people, and the idea of building a new community around a university on 93,000 acres of land that was essentially a farm was really captivating to a lot of people. So there was a lot of public support. There was enthusiasm for this to happen. As time went by, changes in the law, changes in attitudes, it was a very different world that the new owners faced in 1977. And when Bren bought and took control in 1983, it was a very different world. So he had a lot of challenges to face, not the least of which was, bringing a new company under his own leadership. And Bren was not then and is not now a real public man. He wasn't a guy who went out and met all the community leaders. He tended to be very private. So very different world, 1983 to 1960.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking to see so many NIMBYs when you're trying to really help the community and build beautiful things that will make their lives better. And so after he acquired this percentage, what did it take to get the rest, in your opinion?
Well, the company was sold in 1977 for $337 million. The buyout that occurred in 1983, correct me, Mike, if I get these numbers wrong, put the valuation at around $1 billion. And the other owners were, well, the immediate payout was about $500 million. Then the Joan Irvine Smith payout occurred later. So there was quite a value increase in that 6-year period. Probably you could say that even though people were amazed at the figure for the 1977 purchase, in my view, it was probably a bit of a steal.
Yeah.
And that reflected the fact that it was so very hard for people to value what all this land would be worth. There were many uncertainties. There were, as one person we interviewed said, there are no comps. There were no comps. So this is not a typical real estate valuation exercise where you assemble a series of properties, look at what the rents are, go through the 3 different approaches to valuation. This was not that. So there was a great increase in value, but at the same time, the challenges that Mike has mentioned with transportation and other issues were formidable. But I think the interesting thing, I think you were asking, what shapes Mr. Bren's focus on things. And I would say what shapes his focus is an incredibly broad bandwidth of perspective as compared to most people involved in real estate. For example, he will spend quite a bit of time looking at a site plan and making sure the houses next to each other and the windows of one house to another house do not allow people to look in the other person's house. Then he can look at the entire ranch and figure out the purpose and intent and begin to think about how to implement open space and habitat preserves the amount to over 50,000 acres. There are very few people that can work across that dimension of detail.
Incredible.
I think the other element of this was Bren surrounded himself by people who were very energetic, They were well paid. They were motivated. And as Pike and I experienced, when things needed to be done, the usual response was, well, figure out how to get it done and tell us the resources you need to make that happen. The Irvine Company never had a lobbyist in Washington, D.C. We ended up hiring somebody there, and it made a tremendous difference in some of the issues that we had to deal with at the time. So Bren was very willing to expend resources. He was not a spendthrift. There were budgets, but it was a huge property. It was a huge job. The other element in this is, and we write about it in our book, is when you've got 93,000 acres in 4 or 5 different jurisdictions, you have the ability, if you choose to kind of move your emphasis from place to place, depending on what the political realities were. I think it's fair to say in the city of Newport Beach, as time went on, there was a much greater resistance to continuing development there, very strong anti-growth groups there. In the city of Irvine, less so, just because of the nature of what was there. In Laguna Beach, a lot of resistance. But then up in the city of Tustin, a vast development, commercial development was open or was welcomed with open arms there. So we equated it in our book to saying it's like playing poker and you have 3 decks of cards and your opponent has 1.
Yeah.
With a lot of land and a lot of flexibility and a willingness to be creative, you have the ability to do that. And Bren realized that.
Incredible.
Yeah, and there's one other factor that I think is important from a real estate perspective to understand. When the initial planning for the transformation of the ranch got underway in the early 60s, there's not a lot of agriculture, there's not a lot of income. There was agriculture, but it wasn't generating tremendous cash flow. But the positive element was there was no debt on the property, which is unusual in the world of master plan community development. And when you combine that with the incredible growth of Orange County, the population of Orange County in 1960 was around 700,000. By 1970, it had doubled to 1,400,000. And so there was this incredible growth. So incredible growth combined with lack of debt really helped. Then when the company was acquired, and then when Bren bought out the other partners, he essentially did a leverage buyout using all the revenue from the income properties that had been developed to fund the payoff to the other partners. And with his timing was good. If he'd done it a few years later, it might not have worked out so well, given the cycles in the economy. But he was able to pay down a lot of his acquisition financing very quickly. And so that put the company in a great position to be able to take the long view. So when you combine that with his long-term perspective and the ability to implement on a long-term perspective, that contributes a lot to the success of the ranch. If there was someone who was trying to prevent something from happening, the company could just kind of sit back and work it out and strategize and then come back and deal with things a few years later.
Okay. So far I heard hiring and putting resources where they're needed, but not in an irresponsible way. So whatever resources were needed, he would give it to you guys, and then hiring the best team and paying them well.
Right.
Is what I gather so far.
Yeah, there was a culture. I think it actually began in the 60s with the work on the big plan and all that, and carried through the sale of the company and into later years. In fact, one of the things we talk about in the book is how the group that was assembled to work on the big plan and implement it was a relatively young crowd. They were in their 20s. I think the oldest gentleman who was in the working part of it was Bill Mason, who later became president. He was 41 years old when he came to work for the company. Everybody else was younger. They were smart people, and these were guys. It's back then, they were all guys. But they had strong educational backgrounds, not a lot of experience, some experience, and they kind of didn't know what they couldn't do, and they figured it out.
Interesting.
And that attitude, I think, carried forward certainly into the time period when Mike and I were there, and I think in the years beyond. It really was a situation where you had smart people and they were just told to go do it.
Very cool.
And Stephanie, I think one of the other factors when you think about the kind of the menu of things that was available to the Irvine Company and to Mr. Bren was the presence of the University of California. And as time has gone on, the fact that the university is there has provided just an enormous foundation for excellence, for growth. You know, there's a great saying, Daniel Patrick Moynihan said, if you want a great city, build a university and wait 200 years. In the case of Irvine, they built a great university, and just 50 years later, you see what's happened. Bren realized this. He made very strong overtures to the university to form a partnership, and we see that today at the University Research Park, which is a joint venture of the Irvine Company and the university. It's something that is now, at my last reckoning, is providing about $7 million a year in revenue directly to the university. And probably, I think it's about 45 years from now, maybe 40 years from now, all the buildings that are built on university property there will be deeded to the university. And Pike estimates that at that time it's going to be worth $250 to $300 million. It'll be the largest donation to the University of California in history. And so seeing what the university brought, both in terms of people, other resources, the fact that it's there, and we really owe, I think, based on our research, we owe a lot of that, the fact that it's there, to Joan Irvine Smith. She was on the board of directors of the Irvine Company at the time. She was the granddaughter of the founder of the ranch, James Irvine II. And it was really Joan's leadership convincing the other people there and family members that the university should be built there. And that's a great legacy for her.
Absolutely. And when I first came to work at the company, I was a little unsure as to what the significance of the university was to the program that was being implemented. I knew that it had kicked off the planning, and that was clear. But what I didn't realize, but now understand, is that the university put the Irvine Ranch on the map. I mean, it's a big property, but people really didn't know that it existed. And many people still really don't know the magnitude of it, but they know where UC Irvine is. And so that it put it on the map in the early years. In the later years, as Mike has mentioned, it really became an attraction magnet for creative industries. And what's going on now with bioscience and all in that area is driven in large part by the university. And Mike's right, the value of the joint venture, I just did a rough present value calculation on what's out there now, discounting back from years in the future when it will ultimately all transfer to UCI, and came up with a number of about a third of $1 billion of value to the university in that park. So it's really quite phenomenal. And that's another, I think, element of Donald Bren's broad bandwidth in figuring out to do things and how to create value and create enthusiasm and energy that goes way beyond a single real estate investor and extends out into the broader community.
Sure. Yeah. Fascinating.